Welcome to Freddy's Huge Ask Podcast. Huge lives and the stories behind them. And now here's your host, Freddy Cruz.
Tom Abrams is an Emmy and Edward R. Murrow award-winning TV journalist and author of more than a dozen novels, including the all-new Jackson Quick series. And Tom joins the pod right now.
Good to be with you, Freddy. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you are a TV journalist and an author, and I'd love to begin with how the two have maybe inspired one another.
Sure. So I got into journalism when I was in high school because I like to write. So I wrote for my high school newspaper. Before that, I was a reader, and I didn't really put the two together until a ninth grade English teacher read my first paper and said, "You must read a lot." And so I thought, well, I guess the two kind of go hand in hand. So writing is why I got into journalism. And I always, in the back of my mind, had this idea I wanted to write a book. And about 25 years ago, I started working on my first novel. And it's been a very slow churn since then.
How long did it take for you to put out your first novel? Because some people will take half of a lifetime before they realize they've got something decent.
So I wrote the first book, and it was a crime, sort of a police procedural book that featured a television journalist. And it took me about 3 years to write it. And then I started shopping it to agents. And then through a friend of a friend, got it to somebody at a publishing house, and they read it and they said, "Look, you could write for a living, but this isn't the story. Here's what you do well. Here's what you don't do well." And then Michael Connolly, of all people, read that manuscript and trashed it and said, "Here's what you do well, here's what you don't do well." But he gave me like this 9-page critique, which I still have, and years later got him to sign. And that was sort of the beginning. And then I started and stopped probably 5 or 6 different ideas. None of them clicked until I finally had this idea for a political thriller, which took me maybe 2 years to write. And then I slowly got the process down to 9 months. And now it's typically about 90 to 100 days I'll write a novel.
All this while you're on TV.
Right.
That's great.
It's my side hustle.
Yeah. Okay. So by side hustle, are you writing for 1 or 2 hours, or does it change by the morning or the night whenever you write?
I do something every day. I sometimes I will use a dictation service when I'm driving into and from work, because I have a pretty long commute. And so that's very helpful because it serves sort of as that first rough draft of a chapter or a paragraph or even a section of a book. And then when I go back to fix all of the things that the dictation service misheard, it's really like a second pass, and I can fix things and add things and delete things. So I do a lot of that, and that speeds up the process a lot. I write in the mornings, I write at night when I get home. If I'm on a deadline, I'll spend most of my days off doing this. I have a very understanding wife and family. And so it's like it's turned into a second job, but it's a really great creative escape. And I know you relate to that. You have a full-time job, plus you write.
Back when I was working at a top 40 radio station that shall remain nameless, I was lucky enough to have a bunch of vacation time. And so what do you do when you've got a week off and the kids are at school? You play with your imaginary friends, obviously.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, it's interesting though that you use dictation. I've listened to a few podcasts with authors who do that. So you're literally talking to yourself. How does that work when you're driving? I know that you're talking and then you're focusing on the road and you hit a speed bump. Is it like, "Oh crap, Tom, what are you doing? Where did you lose your place?" How does that work?
The only problem is if I have an incoming call and it stops the dictation, and then it won't save it. So I have to, by trial and error and losing thousands of words, I figured out I could just take a screenshot of it and then retype it in later. But I typically will go into a drive with an idea of what I want to talk about. And if I run out, if the idea falls short, or if it's not where I thought it was going to go, I'll just stop. And then I go back. And what I've been doing most of today is going back and fixing about 5,000 words that I'd written over the course of a week. And fixing those and rewriting those. And even within that dictation, I'll have notes to myself like, because you can't go back and delete a paragraph. So I'll say, scratch that last paragraph and put this here instead, or move this around. So I have notes to myself even within the dictation about what I want to do.
That's that TV production, that's the TV production side getting to you. So like with an interview, I could be like, okay, we're going to pick this up in post, and then boom.
Right.
So you're basically applying those skills in TV to the art of crafting a novel.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I apply to writing novels from my day job is working under deadline. In TV news, we have multiple deadlines within the course of a 8 to 10 to 12 hour shift.
Yeah.
And these deadlines are much longer. So I set daily or weekly deadlines for myself. I need to have this done by this time. I need to have this, so that I'm always hitting my long-term goal, which is, the submit date to an editor and then the publication date, whatever else.
How often do you get inspired to write a scene or an entire story based on a real life experience you've had in the field?
Good question. So the official answer is I don't write anything that I experience in the field. I keep my two jobs separate, but I can say, and what my accountant would tell you when talking to the IRS, is that everything an author does inspires what they write. And it doesn't matter whether I'm having a conversation with somebody while I'm standing in line for a coffee, or whether I'm driving down the road, or I'm on a flight, and whatever you witness, it's all inspiration for something. I can say some of my series, take place in locations that I've gone to for work, because as a TV journalist, a lot of times you get to experience things that most people wouldn't. Even if you go to a place a lot of people go, you see it in a way that a lot of people don't. And so that has helped inform my writing in a lot of ways. I don't think I ever draw specifically from something that happens at work, but there are elements or amalgamations of things that happen in my everyday life that I then put into the story.
I want to go back to something that you had touched on, and that was kind of having an idea of what you're going to write. And I imagine this plays a huge role in why you're able to crank out so much work in a short amount of time. So I got to ask, are you a complete outliner, or are you what we call in the publishing business a pantser, where you fly by the seat of your pants and just, for lack of better terms, make crap up on the go and then fix it on the back end?
Yes, I'm both.
A plantser.
Right. So I'll have, the way I describe it when people ask me this question is, maybe going into a book, I know, if you look at it as an alphabet, I know A and C and T and Z. I know how the book is going to start. I know how it's going to end. And I know some major points in the middle. And then as I start writing, I begin to fill in those plot points. So if you were to look at an unfinished manuscript, you'll see that I have, what I've written, plus I'll have maybe 2-3 sentences, and then a dash, and 2 or 3 sentences and a dash. So I know where the story's going. But then as the story evolves, I may change things around or delete things or condense or, but I always have sort of this very loose working outline as I go that becomes more and more specific as I get closer to the end of the book.
Which leads me to your latest work, and that is the Jackson Quick series. So let's talk about that. Give me the elevator pitch.
Yeah, they put out the box set of those 3 books, and essentially it's a reluctant hero who's in over his head and finds himself in a conspiracy that has stretched his entire life, and he's just now uncovering it as a young adult, who works in Austin as a political aide, and he gets kidnapped, asked questions about some things he's been doing that he knew were probably on the shady side, but didn't realize just how deep he was into this conspiracy. So the first book is him uncovering this first conspiracy and saving his own life, and finding out that all the people around him have no allegiance to him. It takes place mostly in Texas. Then the second book expands on it. They're each standalone stories, but they build on his understanding of his own background. And the second and third stories are more international in scope, as he figures out how his entire life has been somewhat planned for him without him ever knowing it, and how the traumatic experiences he underwent as a young kid were not his fault, but rather the work of some darker forces. And so it's sort of a political techno thriller It's had elements of politics and sort of James Bondish type stuff going on. It was a lot of fun to write, and that story has had a fascinating journey. I wrote it before I was traditionally published, and an editor I was working with suggested it to a traditional publisher called Post Hill Press. They bought that book and two more, the first book and two more. And so I signed my first traditional deal with them, but the book never really did anything. And so after years of it just languishing, I bought it back from them, sold it to another publisher, who then I rewrote it and updated it, and they republished it, and we got a deal with Audible for the audiobooks. So it's probably one of my favorite series, and it's seen many lifetimes.
Yeah, I've never heard of that path. So you you got it traditionally published, and then you waited because it didn't really do much, and so you bought it back. So what was the process like? You know, going to the publishing house saying, "Hey, the book didn't really do much under your wing. I want it back." And is it as easy as dropping a check? Or is there like some kind of battle like, well, no, Mr. Abrams?
Well, so when this publisher was pre-existing, but they were just kind of getting into what I was writing. And so I was one of their first authors in fiction. And so I had a really good relationship with them, and they did everything they could. Sometimes a book just doesn't hit. Yeah. And I was more and more of my sales as a percentage come from audiobooks. And I really wanted to release these in audiobooks, and they were not interested in doing that. And so after some time, I'd already bought back another series from them, and then published it myself. And so I waited, and ultimately they said, okay, you've been good to us. We get it. Here's what we'll sell it back to you for. And so it was reasonable. And the new deal I was going to get to sell it to this other, I already had it lined up with another publisher. And that deal was, made it worth buying the books back. And they haven't done as well as a lot of my post-apocalyptic work, which is what sort of pays the bills. But I loved writing that series.
And you know what? As a storyteller, sometimes that's all that matters, is that you had a blast doing it. You got from point A to point B, and you enjoyed every minute of the ride.
I did. It was a lot of fun, a lot of research, and I love those characters. And the villain in that series appears in another series. It's just, I really liked those. And that was originally my path, was sort of these political techno thriller type stories, until I wrote Postapocalyptic, and it did really well. And that became where the bulk of my audience now lies.
What is it with humans and post-apocalyptic situations?
So once I said to my editor, when one of my books was doing really well, I wrote to her and I said, people must really like reading about the end of the world. And she said, no, people like reading about surviving the end of the world. And so I think there is this innate idea of what would I do in this circumstance? And I love to see how people survive and work their way through situations that are untenable for most. And there is a real community out there of people who are prepared for the end of the world, or the end of the world as we know it. And that genre will, I think, never go away.
Yeah, no. Humans are weird. It's like we say we don't want to engage with whatever the current thing is. Oh, I'm so sick of that. Well, right. Actually, the algorithms suggest otherwise.
Absolutely. I mean, the end of the world is as old as the Bible, right? Yeah. I mean, and so from Revelation forward, people have had a fascination with how is our society going to end. And I think the themes may change. There are different subgenres of the post-apocalyptic or dystopian landscape. Yeah. Some do better than others, but they're all fascinating, and the readers are very loyal.
Right. Well, and I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about your latest post-apocalyptic series, which is the Crusader series, and it follows the story of an EDM, an EDM. My mind is in music.
It's
It follows the
music,
story of
right?
an EMP attack, an electromagnetic pulse, which I had just learned about that maybe a few years ago, what that was, and it's kind of terrifying.
It is, because what happens is the power goes out, right?
Yeah.
And it destroys the infrastructure. And so you're kind of sending the world back to a stone age. And so what happens at the beginning of this book is there is an attack by a foreign nation, which the characters never know for sure which nation it is, that sends a series of jets across the country, and they deploy these electromagnetic pulse weapons, which essentially throw most of the country back into the 17th century, 18th century. And the feel of the first book, maybe the second book, has sort of this kind of Wild West flavor to it that happens after the power goes out. And the main character is a guy named John Beck, and he's called the Crusader because he's on this crusade to find his missing daughter. And as he goes across the country looking for her, finding these breadcrumbs and looking for her, he helps other people along the way, almost a Kung Fu-esque type journey. And so book 4 is out at the end of June. Book 5 will be out at the end of December, and that'll be the series. It's been fun to write. I had not written an electromagnetic pulse themed series before, so this was fun.
Yeah, because I mean, who wouldn't want to live in a post-apocalyptic world where we are literally back in the 1800s or the 1700s in 2022? And one of the things that I found fun in a demented way about that story was how John was working on an oil rig. So how do you get back to the mainland?
Right. So he's offshore in the Gulf of Mexico, off the Alabama coast when the power goes out, and he's got to find his way back to shore. And I wanted to have something different. I wanted to start the book in a completely different way than what is typically out there, even though post-apocalyptic and dystopian readers kind of like that same story over and over again. I'm always looking for some way to make it a little bit different.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about people wanting to, kind of picture how they would act in that situation. And I'm reading the book like, yeah, I don't know what I'd do. I mean, I'm stuck on an oil rig.
I'd probably be.
Do I jump in the Gulf of Mexico and hope I get eaten by a shark? Oh, wait, no, I need to save my daughter. Well, how do I get to my daughter? I don't know if she's even alive.
Exactly. Well, and I joke, if the world really does go to pot, I'm probably one of the first not to survive. But it's fun to write about how these people not just survive, but thrive in a way. And what's fascinating to me is that you'll have some people think that, when we write these stories, that the world devolves too fast. But I don't think that's the case. I think, within a week of knowing that the power is not coming back on, things start to go bad pretty quickly.
Well, yeah. And you see how people act with toilet paper during a pandemic with, coronavirus. Yep.
Yeah. And I had a series come out just coincidentally, about, it was a spin-off series about a plague that came out right as we were really in the throes of COVID. And I debated whether or not I should release the series, but it had been long planned. And then I figured, well, if nobody reads it because they're tired of this, that's fine. And now I think those 3 books are my best 3 selling audiobooks. People just like, it's an escape regardless, I guess.
Yeah.
To think somebody else is worse off than I am.
To throw in a little bit of current events, do you go back and maybe edit in a couple of passages, or have you left them as is?
So with that series, because I had written the first book, it's the Scourge series, and I had written the first book and was almost done with the second, I think, when COVID kind of became a concern. I went back into the first book because it was still not scheduled to launch, I think, until it was like a May or June launch. I went back and I added some things, toilet paper being one of them. There was already a scene where people were fighting for water in a grocery store, but then I went and I added some other things that we experienced in real life. And then in this series, the Crusader, there are references to the way people behaved during COVID, because this series takes place sometime in the near future. So I have made sure that there are references to it without it being too on the nose.
Right. I love that. So a bit of a rapid fire before we wrap up the interview, Tom, and that would be, what is your favorite place to write?
I used to go write at Whataburger every morning. I would take my son to school and I would sit there with their unlimited coffee, and I'd sit in a corner and I would write for about 4 hours. So I loved writing at Whataburger. Their coffee was good and you could refill it for free. Now I think it's probably just in my office. Since COVID, things have changed. So it would be writing in my house, in my, where I live.
What is harder to write, the first sentence or the last?
I'd say the middle sentence. I mean, because I know the beginning and I know the end. It's somewhere in the middle that it's hard.
Stranded on an island with 2 books, one fiction and one nonfiction. What are they?
Fiction, Animal Farm. I've read it, I can't tell you how many times, and I would read it 1,000 times more. Nonfiction. That's a really good question. Let's come back to that. I pass. Let's come back to that one.
We'll pass. Why should readers inspired by your work open up their laptop or dictation device and crank out their first manuscript?
I think because anybody could do it. It's just a matter of discipline, right? It's anybody could write a book if you do a little bit every day. That's the key, I think. And that's what took me so long with the first one, is I did not write every day. It was a little bit here, a little bit there. Once you start writing every day, it's like every habit. It's like working out. You get into this rhythm, and then on a day when you are thinking about not doing it, you just feel uncomfortable about it, so you do it.
Best place for people to get in touch with Tom Abrams and find out all about your books?
You can go to tomabramsbooks.com. It's also pitonpress.com, pitonpress.com.
Tom Abrams, appreciate you coming by the podcast.
Thanks so much, Freddie, and good luck with your writing too.